The target wasn't a military base or a government building. It was a massive fulfillment warehouse on the outskirts of Moscow, the kind of place where cardboard boxes stacked to the ceiling and shipping labels move through by the thousands every hour, the kind of place the packages come from that show up on the doorsteps of millions of ordinary Russians. Except that, in the early hours of July 18th, that same roof became a wall of fire visible for miles, and the smell of burning plastic settled over an entire city that never imagined it would feel this war so close to home. There was no air raid siren, not a single soldier in sight, just a black cloud climbing higher and higher, while passengers on commercial flights approaching Sheremetyevo Airport filmed the scene through their windows, not yet understanding what they were looking at. Call it the most devastating day of the war for Moscow if you want. That's the headline that spread across international outlets hours after the attack. But calling it devastating without any further explanation would be a dangerous overstatement. The Kremlin is still standing, the Russian army is still fighting on the front line, and not a single essential power plant stopped running because of that fire. What actually happened that morning is stranger and in some ways more revealing than any headline suggests. For the first time in years, the war knocked on the door of people who thought they lived safely inside the Russian capital. And what comes next only gets worse for the Kremlin. The fire started in Elektrostal, a city roughly 30 miles east of Moscow, inside the administrative region known as Moscow Oblast. That's where one of the largest distribution centers belonging to Wildberries was located, Russia's biggest online retailer, the kind of company Russians themselves compare to Amazon. To put the scale in perspective, this single facility processed close to 10% of the company's entire sales volume nationwide, a workload comparable to one of Amazon's biggest U.S. fulfillment centers during its busiest season of the year. According to Regional Governor Andrei Vorobyov, the attack killed at least one person at that center and injured 37 others, with one of them later dying in the hospital. A few miles away in Noginsk, drone debris hit a fuel depot, sparking a second fire that forced the evacuation of a maternity hospital and an entire apartment building. In Elektrostal, fragments from another drone landed on a kindergarten, and a small fire there also had to be brought under control. While Moscow dealt with the smoke, another attack, an even deadlier one, was unfolding more than 200 miles away, in the city of Kotovsk in the Tambov region. A second Wildberries logistics center, this one run in partnership with another Russian company, was hit during the night shift. According to local authorities, 7 workers died on site and more than 20 were injured. Combining both cities, the death toll from that night passed 8, and the number of wounded topped 60, according to Russian official figures that, as always in these cases, could still be revised. For 5 years, attacks on distribution centers, hospitals, and apartment buildings in Ukraine have been part of this war's daily news cycle, so routine that much of the international audience stopped reacting to them as front-page stories. Ukrainian postal services, like Nova Poshta, have been hit repeatedly, with civilians killed in strikes on package hubs, without any of it changing Russian government behavior. What's different now is that the same logic of war has reached territory the Russian public spent 5 years learning to consider untouchable. And that contrast between indifference from the outside and shock from the inside is exactly what explains why that smoke over Moscow hit so hard. On Russian social media, what showed up wasn't political commentary, it was commercial despair. One shop owner, according to accounts published hours after the attack, went to the site just to, in her own words, say goodbye to the items she sold. In total, she lost roughly 54,000 products, with no right to any compensation because the platform's own terms of service exempt the company from liability in cases of fire caused by military attacks. Multiply that story by thousands of small sellers who depend on Wildberries to survive, and it becomes easier to understand why market analysts are already estimating losses above $1 billion just from the 2 centers hit that night. The ripple effect of that destruction is already showing up in how Russian merchants operate. According to local outlets, a growing number of small sellers are shifting to work out of their own homes or tiny unmarked warehouses, specifically to fall outside the range of future attacks. Over the medium term, that trend could erode the model of giant centralized logistics hubs that fueled the growth of Russian e-commerce over the past decade, forcing an expensive and inefficient fragmentation that cuts tax revenue from large-scale operations right at a moment when the Kremlin needs that revenue most to fund the war. Before getting into the details that explain why this attack is more complicated than it looks, a quick note. This channel exists to break down armed conflicts and geopolitical shifts in depth without picking sides and without oversimplifying what's complicated. If that kind of analysis is something you're looking for, consider subscribing, because stories like this one show up here every week, often before they hit the headlines anywhere else. According to Moscow Mayor Sergei Sobyanin, more than 370 drones headed toward the Russian capital and its surrounding region in a single night, a record since the war began. From Russian officials came the usual version of events. 64 drones were supposedly intercepted on approach to the city, with the rest falling without causing major damage. Except weather satellite imagery, the kind used to monitor wildfires, showed a smoke cloud covering more than 50 miles of Moscow Oblast. Near total interception and a smoke cloud visible from space don't belong in the same sentence. Something in that math doesn't add up, and it isn't Ukraine's arithmetic that's wrong. International coverage treated the target like just another retailer caught in the crossfire of war. But just over a year ago, Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov tried to seize control of Wildberries by force, going as far as sending armed men to occupy the company's headquarters in the middle of an ownership dispute. The attempt was only stopped after personal intervention from Vladimir Putin, who secured control of the retailer for an oligarch in his inner circle. So when Ukrainian drones set a Wildberries warehouse on fire, they're not just destroying clothing and electronics inventory. They're burning down an asset that was once fought over at gunpoint inside the Kremlin's own power structure. On the other side of the border, the machine that produced this drone swarm is going through a quiet crisis of its own. Days before the attack, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky removed Mikhailo Fedorov from the defense ministry, the 35-year-old official credited by analysts as the driving force behind modernizing Ukraine's drone warfare in recent months. Fedorov's departure, after he publicly accused Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky of blocking reforms and making decisions based on loyalty rather than data, triggered 2 straight days of protests in the streets of Kyiv, with demonstrators calling for Syrsky's own removal. It's inside that atmosphere of internal tension that Ukraine chose to launch one of its largest long-range drone offensives of the entire war. Technically, the two militaries are taking different paths at this stage of the conflict. Ukraine is betting heavily on volume, long-range drones, many of them guided in real time by operators wearing virtual reality goggles, in what's known as first-person view, or FPV. Some of these drones run on ultra-thin fiber optic cables, which makes them nearly immune to the radio jammers that make up Russia's main electronic defense. Russia, on the other hand, holds the edge in precision and destructive power with its ballistic missiles, capable of hitting cities like Kyiv within minutes, leaving even the West's most advanced air defense systems with almost no interception window. It's a war of trade-offs, quantity against precision, saturation against concentrated firepower. Behind the scenes of that shakeup, Ukrainian command has also repositioned elite units, including one known as Rubicon, pulling them back temporarily from the most exposed frontline positions, a tactical call that, according to military sources, aims to preserve experienced operators for future long-range offensives, even at the cost of reduced presence in some sectors of the front. While the world's attention turned to the smoke over Moscow, Ukraine was also ramping up naval strikes in the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. Over the past few weeks, more than 10 Russian vessels, including warships, tankers, and tugboats, have been hit or damaged near Novorossiysk. In a systematic campaign of drone strikes against power substations and fuel terminals, like the one in Feodosia, has been isolating the peninsula year after year. Analysts compare it to what's known as the Hormuz scenario. Just as the risk of attack keeps tankers away from a strait in the Middle East, the constant threat of drones is pushing commercial vessels away from the shipping routes that supply Crimea, the peninsula more and more, into a logistically isolated island inside territory Russia still claims to control. For international insurers, the practical effect already shows up as higher risk premiums for any vessel approaching Russian ports in the Black Sea, driving up the cost of trade that keeps the Kremlin's war economy running. Ukrainian military intelligence reports, still not independently confirmed, point to a new wave of Russian mobilization this fall, potentially calling up as many as 500,000 men to rebuild an army worn down by more than 4 years of continuous combat. If confirmed, it would be one of the largest call-ups since the invasion began back in 2022, a sign that, despite the propaganda promising imminent victory, the Kremlin knows this war is far from over. For a country that has already lost, according to unconfirmed Western estimates, hundreds of thousands of soldiers between killed and wounded since the invasion began. Finding 500,000 new recruits willing to fight is, on its own, a serious logistical and political challenge. International analysts keep insisting that Crimea's growing isolation should eventually force Vladimir Putin to accept some kind of ceasefire. But so far, nothing in the Kremlin's posture supports that prediction. Putin treats the peninsula as a personal symbol of his political legacy, not as a disposable logistical asset. And symbolism and logistics rarely follow the same cost-benefit logic. As long as Crimea keeps being treated as a trophy and not as shared strategic territory, no amount of purely military pressure is going to be enough to change the Kremlin's calculation. The Ukrainian goal behind these attacks was never just about causing financial damage. According to defense analysts, the real target is breaking the illusion of normal life that has propped up domestic support for the war inside Russia for more than 4 years. As long as bombs were only falling on the other side of the border, it was easy for the average Russian citizen to treat the conflict as something distant, almost abstract. The smoke over Moscow changes that equation, even though the Kremlin is still standing and the front line remains largely unchanged. If this kind of analysis, one that goes beyond the easy headline and tries to understand what's actually at stake, is something you value, now's a good time to subscribe. Stories like this one, connecting economics, domestic politics, and military strategy, show up here every week. At the end of the day, that fulfillment warehouse in Elektrostal didn't burn down by accident, and the fire it left behind wasn't just about lost clothes and electronics. It was about a retailer once fought over at gunpoint by a Chechen warlord, about a Ukrainian military trying to modernize in the middle of a very public command crisis, about a Russia that had learned to ignore this war right up until it literally knocked on the capital's door. The day wasn't devastating in the sense the original headline suggested. The Kremlin is still standing, but it was devastating enough to remind Moscow of something Kiev has known for more than 4 years now. No capital, no matter how protected it looks, is truly out of this war's reach. If you made it this far, you already understand. This war doesn't come down to maps and numbers alone. It's also measured in burned-out warehouses and families who lost everything in a single night. If this video helped you see the situation more clearly, subscribe to the channel and keep following these breakdowns. And tell me in the comments, are you watching from the United States or from Spain? And which side of this board do you think is actually deciding how this war ends?